In the year 1100, on the floodplain across the river from where St. Louis stands today, there was a city of roughly 20,000 people. It had a structure at its centre, Monks Mound, with a footprint larger than the Great Pyramid of Giza. By the year 1400, that city was completely empty. If you've watched any other video about this place, you've probably heard it called America's Lost Mega City, or the mystery nobody can explain. At least 8 channels have uploaded almost exactly that video in the last 12 months alone. Here's what almost none of them tell you. The actual scientists who study this site are not united behind any single mystery. They are actively publicly disagreeing with each other in peer-reviewed journals as recently as last year. Here's exactly what this video is going to do. I'm going to show you the actual competing scientific papers, not vague experts believe, but specific named researchers, specific journals, specific years, and I'm going to show you why they disagree. By the end, you'll understand not just what might have happened to Cahokia, but why the unsolved mystery framing you've seen elsewhere is, itself, part of the problem. This is the vertical archive, and we follow the documents. Let's start with the first one, and it involves something you would not expect: ancient human waste. The Fecal Record, How You Count a Population with No Census, in February 2019, a research team led by A.J. White, then a graduate student at California State University, Long Beach, published a study in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, one of the most respected scientific journals in the world. Their method sounds almost absurd until you understand the logic. They extracted sediment cores from Horseshoe Lake, immediately adjacent to the Cahokia site, and measured the concentration of a specific fecal biomarker called coprostanol, a compound produced in the human gut and deposited over centuries into the lake mud whenever a population nearby is large enough to leave a measurable trace. This is, quite literally, a population count made of ancient human waste, layered in lake sediment like the rings of a tree. What the cores showed, a population that began rising significantly after 600 C, reaching its peak around 1100 C, consistent with roughly 20,000 residents, and then declining sharply, reaching near zero by approximately 1400 C. Cross-referenced against the same lake core's climate data, the team found something specific: declining summer precipitation beginning around 1150 C, and evidence of a significant Mississippi River flood at almost exactly the same time. Drought and flooding, in the same data, in the same years the population begins its decline. This was widely reported as confirming a climate-driven collapse. And for several years, that's largely where the story stood in popular media. Here's where it gets interesting. Because 5 years after that PNAS study, a different research team went looking for confirmation of a related theory and found the evidence wasn't there. The deforestation theory falls apart the theory everyone repeated for years. One of the most widely repeated explanations for Cahokia's decline was deforestation, the idea that as the city's population grew, residents cut down the surrounding forest faster than it could regenerate for construction timber and fuel, eventually triggering erosion, flooding, and agricultural failure. It's a tidy, intuitive story. A growing city outstrips its own resources and collapses under that weight. It's also the kind of story that gets repeated in documentary after documentary because it requires no further investigation. It sounds like exactly what should have happened. In 2024, archaeologists from Washington University in St. Louis decided to actually test it. What the soil actually showed researcher Dr. Caitlin Rankin led excavations around the earthen mounds, extracting soil cores and analysing carbon isotopes, a method that can detect specific signatures of large-scale erosion events in the soil layers, the kind you would expect to see if a region had been stripped of tree cover. Published in the journal The Holocene, the findings directly challenged the deforestation narrative. The research found, in Dr. Rankin's own words, scant evidence that erosion consistent with significant wood overuse had occurred at the scale the older theory required. This doesn't mean Cahokia's residents weren't using wood. They certainly were. It means the specific causal chain overcutting leads to erosion, leads to flooding, leads to collapse, does not show up clearly in the actual soil record at the scale the theory needs to explain a population decline of this magnitude. A separate, related study, also published in 2024 and led by Caitlin Rankin alongside Natalie Mueller, examined the correlation between late Holocene climate change and Cahokia's population dynamics directly, published in the journal The Holocene under the title Correlating Late Holocene Climate Change and Population Dynamics at Cahokia Mounds. Their analysis reinforced the climate connection from the 2019 study, while specifically setting aside the deforestation explanation as insufficiently supported. So if it's not simple deforestation and the climate data is real but contested in its specifics, what does that actually leave us with? This is where I want to introduce you to a term archaeologists use that almost never makes it into popular coverage of this topic: the ecocide narrative. When archaeologists criticize each other the ecocide problem in a 2023 paper published in the Journal of Archaeological Research, titled Eschewing the Apocalyptic, Recent Research on the Aftermath of Collapse in Archaeology Across the Americas, researcher Nicola Sherratt directly critiques what she and others in the field call the ecocide narrative, the tendency. In both popular media and some academic work, to frame the end of a civilization as a single, dramatic, almost apocalyptic event with one clean cause, usually environmental self-destruction. This critique isn't aimed specifically at Cahokia, but it applies directly to how Cahokia gets discussed outside academic circles. The popular version of this story, repeated across dozens of YouTube videos right now, compresses a genuinely complicated, multi-causal, multi-decade process into a single dramatic question: what destroyed this city overnight? But the actual research doesn't support an overnight collapse at all. The population decline shown in the 2019 lake core data happened gradually, across roughly 2 centuries, from a peak around 1100 C to near abandonment by 1400 C. That's not a collapse. That's a slow demographic decline lasting longer than the entire history of the United States to this point. What collapse actually means here, archaeologist Timothy Porketat, one of the most prominent Cahokia researchers, has written extensively about how the site's decline likely involved political and social factors alongside environmental one's internal governance pressures, shifting religious and ceremonial practices, and changing relationships with surrounding communities, none of which leave as clean a data signature as a lake core sample, but all of which appear in the broader archaeological record. In plain terms, the honest current scientific position is not, we don't know what happened to Cahokia. The honest position is closer to, we know quite a lot about what happened to Cahokia, and what we know describes a slow, complicated, probably multi-causal decline, climate stress, possible social and political strain, and a population that very likely simply dispersed to other Mississippian culture communities throughout the regional network rather than vanishing. That's a much less cinematic story than mystery nobody can explain. It's also the one the actual data supports. Remember that mound from the very start of this video, bigger at its base than the Great Pyramid? I want to take you back to when it was built and what we know about the city that built it, because the construction itself tells us something the collapse debate sometimes leaves out entirely. What was actually built here, the scale, in verifiable numbers Monks Mound, the central structure of the Cahokia site, covers approximately 14 acres at its base and originally rose to roughly 100 feet, built entirely by hand, in stages, over several centuries, using earth moved basket load by basket load. Archaeological estimates place the total volume of earth moved to construct all of Cahokia's mounds there were over 120 of them across the site at its peak, at more than 55 million cubic feet. The site included a grand plaza, a deliberately levelled open space larger than 35 football fields, used for ceremonial gatherings and based on archaeological evidence of game equipment found at the site. For a game called Chunky, played across much of pre-Columbian North America. Researchers have also identified the remains of a structure nicknamed Woodhenge, a series of large wooden post circles rebuilt multiple times over the site's history that align with solstice and equinox sunrise points, indicating sophisticated astronomical observation built into the city's ceremonial architecture. Part of something larger, Cahokia was not an isolated city. It sat at the center of what archaeologists call the Mississippian culture, a broad network of related societies extending across much of what is now the central and southeastern United States, sharing iconography, mound-building traditions, and trade connections that brought materials like copper from the Great Lakes region and shells from the Gulf Coast into Cahokia itself. This matters directly to the collapse question because it changes what decline likely meant in practice. A population dispersing into an existing connected network of related communities is a fundamentally different historical event than a population simply dying out or vanishing without explanation, and it's a distinction the mystery framing used elsewhere almost never makes room for. What we actually know, laying out the actual timeline of research, let's be precise about what's actually been established. In order, because the sequence itself tells a story about how science works that the unsolved mystery framing erases entirely. 2019, the Ness Lake Core Study establishes a population timeline using fecal biomarkers and links the decline to climate data showing drought and flooding beginning around 1150 C. 2023, Nicola Sherratt's paper in the Journal of Archaeological Research critiques the broader tendency across the field to frame these declines in overly dramatic, single-cause collapse terms. 2024, Caitlin Rankin's excavation-based study in the Holocene directly tests and substantially weakens the popular deforestation theory specifically. 2024, Rankin and Muller's follow-up study reinforces the climate-population correlation from 2019, while explicitly setting deforestation aside as a primary cause. This is not a field in chaos. This is a field doing exactly what good science does, proposing an explanation, testing it rigorously, discarding the parts that don't hold up, and refining the parts that do. The mystery isn't that nobody knows anything. The actual situation is that researchers have eliminated at least one popular explanation and substantially refined another in the last 5 years, through direct soil and sediment evidence. That is a more interesting story, I'd argue, than nobody knows. It's science actually working in something close to real time on a question most YouTube videos treat as permanently unanswerable. Why the mystery framing persists, anyway, it's worth asking. Honestly, why so many channels keep producing the same unsolved mystery video about a topic that has an active, traceable, genuinely fascinating research history. The most likely answer isn't malicious, it's that mystery. Nobody knows is simply easier to write than here are 4 peer-reviewed papers from 3 different research teams across 5 years, and here's how they relate to each other. But that easier version costs you something real. It erases the actual scientists doing actual work. And it leaves viewers with the false impression that archaeology is full of permanent, unanswerable mysteries, when the truer picture, at least for Cahokia, is a discipline actively narrowing down the answer in front of us, study by study. Today, Cahokia Mounds is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, one of only a small number in the continental United States. You can walk to the top of Monks Mound. You can stand on the same packed earth that took an estimated 14 million person-hours of labour by some scholarly estimates to construct entirely without wheelbarrows, draft animals, or metal tools. Nobody who built that structure left behind a written explanation for why, 2 centuries after its construction, their descendants began to leave. We don't have that document. We may never have it. But we have something else, an active, ongoing, evidence-based effort to reconstruct the answer anyway, one sediment core, one carbon isotope sample, one carefully reasoned and sometimes contradicted paper at a time. That's not a mystery with no answer. That's a question still being answered, in real time, by people whose names you can look up and whose data you can read yourself. If you've watched one of the other Cahokia videos out there, and there are a lot of them right now, I'd genuinely like to know in the comments what that video told you, and whether anything in this one surprised you by comparison. I'm not trying to call anyone out. I just think the real research deserves more airtime than it's getting. If this approach, following the actual papers instead of the easy mystery framing, is something you want more of, let me know which topic you'd want it applied to next. This has been the Vertical Archive. I'll see you in the next one.